Okay, I'd say we'll start then. So a very warm welcome to all of you around the world to today's GLP webinar organized by the Telecoupling Research Towards Sustainable Transformation of Land Systems Working Group. The webinar today will focus on assessing spillover effects of the Global Biodiversity Targets. We all are aware that conservation actions are essential to halt biodiversity loss. At the same time, there are growing concerns that such conservation interventions can also cause negative spillovers, especially on places far from the actual conservation intervention. The broader picture also highlights the challenge that we need to find ways to navigate human environmental trade-offs that result from conservation interventions, and especially in view of implementing the global biodiversity targets, we also need to find ways to really inform policymaking and implementation actions on how to possibly avoid such negative spillovers from conservation. And therefore, in today's webinar, we will explore potential tools and metrics to integrate justice into global conservation modeling frameworks and anticipating negative spillovers. We have two excellent speakers for you here today. Let me introduce them briefly. We have Camille Venier-Cambron. She's a PhD student at the Department of Environmental Geography, Institute for Environmental Studies at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. Her research focuses on environmental justice in the context of conservation, paying particular attention to the way that planning at larger scales can override local values and land use needs. While she comes from a natural science background, she has been increasingly shifting her focus on political ecology and other related social sciences in order to better address the challenge of meeting our environmental goals in a just and transformative manner. The second speaker is Diana Lucero Ramírez Mejía. She's a postdoc at the same department at the University of Amsterdam, as well as the Wyss Academy for Nature here in Bern. She uses spatial analysis and modeling approaches to understand the spatial temporal patterns of land system changes and their impacts on biodiversity. She's particularly interested in understanding how decisions or changes in human environment system can affect other actors and environments in distant places. She's also worked at the National Commission for the Knowledge and Use of Biodiversity, a federal government agency in Mexico, mainly devoted to quantitative assessments of Mexico's biodiversity. And she's currently part of a project investigating land system science tools for assessing sustainable development pathways and anticipating the displaced consequences of global biodiversity targets together with the Wyss Academy. So with this, I would like to invite Camille to start us off with her presentation. We will have 10 minutes for the presentation, 5 minutes for Q&A. And then a longer discussion, hopefully still at the end after the second presentation. Camille, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for a great introduction and for having me here today. So I'm going to be talking about justice and conservation, but paying particular attention to the importance of scale and problem framing when driving solutions. Next slide, please. So to make sure that we're all starting off on the same page, we understand that we live on this wonderfully diverse planet, but ecosystems everywhere are becoming degraded due to species extinctions and population declines. So if biodiversity loss is due to human activities, then through human intervention, we can manage landscapes and protect species. This is the general logic and motivation behind conservation, of course, but conservation in practice can mean and look like many different things. Next slide, please. Conservation can, has been, and is for sustainable management of economically important species. Here we might think back to elephant conservation during the time of the British Empire or modern forestry management. It can also be for the preservation of wilderness landscapes, such as Yellowstone or Yosemite National Park in America. It can be for the protection of species or ecosystems globally, and here we want to think of the many prioritization maps, such as biodiversity hotspots, which show where different indicators of biodiversity value are concentrated, so that we can effectively triage global resources to stem biodiversity loss. Next slide, please. Conservation can be for sustainable development, for example, integrated conservation and development programs, which aim to stimulate local economies through what is seen as the sustainable management of local land resources. It can be for the preservation of cultural landscapes, such as UNESCO heritage sites, or it can be for the protection of local socioecologies against external interests, such as when indigenous groups mobilize for the recognition of their land rights. Next, please. So we see that the act of conservation can be a reflection of many different values or ideas of what sustainability looks like, and ultimately it is about the governance of land. It is therefore important for us to reflect critically on how conservation has historically been used in ways that contradict contemporary values of justice, as well as reflect on what justice actually means in practice. For example, the maintenance of commercially important species or the establishment of protected areas has a long history of displacing local communities and disrupting land-based practices. And so to address this, early conservation and development programs often sought to improve ecological management in local economies by integrating both into global markets, for example, through ecotourism. But in many cases, the conceptual narrowness through which they defined conservation, development, and governance led to mixed results. And since we're still losing species and ecosystems at an alarming rate, a subset of the conservation community has since swung back into a neo-protectionist paradigm that sees ecological protection as incompatible with human activity, but in other camps, values of justice and land rights remain central. All of this is important because the stories we tell about what sustainability looks like has very real policy implications with wildly different outcomes for landscapes and people at different scales and different places. Next, please. So to bring us to our current moment, in the last COP held by the Convention of Biological Diversity, a target was set to conserve at least 30% of the Earth's surface by 2030. This document also includes a lot of language that speaks to ideals of justice and equity and inclusion, but there's no clear guidance on how to practice this, or perhaps more importantly, on how to protect against injustice. So far, protected areas remain a staple strategy as they are easy to measure and contribute directly to area-based targets, but their expansion will certainly stimulate tensions over land management, particularly if the different ideas of conservation are posed in opposition to one another rather than complementary. Next, please. So moving from quantitative targets to their spatial counterparts, global analyses are attractive because they can help us to coordinate international efforts for the most efficient outcomes, but we also see some clear challenges when it comes to representation. Many global scale planning efforts identify tropical landscapes when it comes to having the highest priority. And Samati et al. Demonstrate this by looking at regions of consensus in between policymakers and conservation scientists. And we see that Amazonia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Southeast Asia have received the highest scores. Next, please. So this has major justice implications because these areas are often also populated by people who depend directly on the landscape for their well-being. So if conservation is practiced in an exclusive manner, it can push people into landlessness, poverty, and food insecurity. This is some research that I did last year when I showed that a number of leading conservation prioritizations and future scenarios recommended or projected that nature expand into areas dominated by land-dependent communities. Land-dependent communities here were identified as places where people likely make land use change decisions for survival and livelihood reasons rather than economic reasons, using the data set developed by Verberg and Malik. And this typology often has insecure land tenure and relies at least partially on their landscape for their nutrition and well-being. So top-down changes to land use governance in these areas can be particularly damaging for social objectives. Next, please. So what are the justice implications that we're most concerned about? To provide a quick summary, the environmental justice movement was initiated in the United States to protect or to protest against the dumping of toxic waste in predominantly racialized or marginalized communities. And calling for a more equitable distribution of the costs and benefits of environmental management is reflected in the dimension of distributive justice. This is commonly promoted alongside principles of equity, which aim to avoid doing harm to the most vulnerable in society. So two other common dimensions that are often discussed in literature are recognitional justice, which means acknowledging all stakeholders involved, particularly those that are historically overlooked, and procedural justice, which refers to meaningful inclusion of all groups in decision-making processes. Next, please. So the environmental justice movement has also expanded from these isolated cases to also include issues like climate change and biodiversity conservation. This is in part stimulated by the fact that these planetary issues are often addressed in global governance arenas, as we saw with the CBD COP. This introduces a certain amount of complexity, as global agendas can have unintended consequences at smaller or more localized scales. Next. So a large part of this is due to the different visions for sustainability or different conservation values held at different scales. So for example, conservation scientists that are concerned with global sustainability may prioritize ecological representation, while national governments might be focused on the management of economically important species, such as forests, and local communities might mobilize for the recognition of their land rights and traditional practices. Next. So tensions can arise when decisions at one scale have an impact on another, such as when global planning results in the establishment of a protected area which displaces local communities, or when local communities seek access to land resources that national governments or global NGOs would rather manage for other purposes. Next. The Environmental Justice Atlas is an online resource where justice scholars can document their case studies. As such, it is not necessarily a representative sample, but it is enough to see that environmental conflicts that arise from biodiversity conservation initiatives are not uncommon. This is a screenshot from just a few days ago, and there are 153 conservation conflicts recorded. Next. So one example of a conservation injustice is this community which has mobilized against a REDD+ program in Brazil. For those that are unfamiliar, REDD+ is basically a carbon offsetting program where polluting industries buy forest leases from developing countries in order to provide a revenue stream that mitigates the need to develop a natural resource economy instead. So when the Brazilian government sold this lease, the local communities who lived here were prevented from using their lands for subsistence purposes, pushing them farther into food insecurity, and marginalization. Next. But conservation can also be used to promote justice. This is an example where a community was suffering from the loss of their coastal landscape due to a sand mining industry in the area. So they mobilized for the conservation of the olive ridley turtle, which depends on local beaches for its nesting ground, and through the conservation of the turtle, they were able to protect their community lands. Next, please. So these authors have gone through the Environmental Justice Atlas and looked at cases which overlap with the WDPA protected areas. And they show that protected areas can result both in unjust and just outcomes. However, extractive industries are a major driver of conflict within protected areas. So conservation may promote both biodiversity and justice outcomes if it is used in alignment to support these local social environmental conflicts or movements in these areas. Next. So to summarize, conservation can mean many different things, but it is essentially a land management tool to achieve a certain vision of sustainability. Different visions have different impacts beyond their scale of planning, and when planning at larger scales leads to undemocratic changes in environmental governance for land-dependent communities, then justice concerns can arise. However, conservation also has the potential to support justice outcomes when used as a tool to protect local landscapes from external socially and environmentally damaging processes. So with that, I hope that was 10 minutes. It's a lot to pack into a short presentation, but thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to hear some questions.
Thank you very much, Camille, for your presentation. Perfect timing indeed. If there are questions from the audience, please write them in the chat. don't seem to be any questions for the moment. We can also continue with the second presentation and then still see if there are questions to you in the end, Camille.
Sure.
Yeah, Diana, would you then be ready?
Hi, sure. I'm going to share my screen.
Thanks.
So there you can see the presentation.
Yes, looks good.
Great, perfect. So thank you everyone at the GLP Telecoupling Working Group for organizing this webinar, and everyone for joining. So what I'll be showing you today is part of a project, the project that I'm doing for this postdoc that Julie kind of like described during the introduction. So the project aims very broadly to identify land system science tools for evaluating and anticipating the unintended consequences or spillover effects of the global biodiversity targets. So we are still a bit on the early stages of this project. So what I'll do is to give you a general overview, and also I want to show you a proof of concept of how we might be able to operationalize spillover effects from policy interventions. So the idea here too is to boost the discussion towards the question of do we have the knowledge and tools to evaluate these processes, or do we need to improve our knowledge, and do we need to generate a new generation of land system models that truly connect global to local to global? So the goal is to exchange ideas about this ongoing discussion. So this is just to set out the context about the agenda for sustainable development. I always assume that everyone knows what the SDGs and the CBD and the UNFCCC are, but maybe not everyone is so familiar with those concepts. So the SDGs, very broadly, the Sustainable Development Goals. In 2015, world leaders adopted a set of goals to eradicate poverty, protect the planet, and ensure prosperity for all as part of a new sustainable development agenda. And why a new sustainable development agenda? Because way before that, in 1992, the Rio Conventions were created. And those are the three Rio Conventions, the UNFCCC, the CBD, and the UNCCD, little less known. So they were also created to address problems caused by climate change, biodiversity conservation, and desertification. And the common thing about these frameworks is that they all have a set of goals and targets that countries or parties commit to achieve. Usually what we can see is that we have separate goals, separate targets, separate conventions, but these goals and targets and conventions are not independent from each other after all, and they are all interconnected. So the message here is that there is a huge concerted global effort to address some of the most pressing problems or challenges that we face today, and mainly the loss of biodiversity and climate change. So despite these global efforts to stop biodiversity loss and biodiversity declines have continued, and these targets and goals have not been achieved. So instead, what we have are these growing concerns that the current efforts to conserve and restore biodiversity and to stop climate change through the implementation of global goals and targets might create unanticipated negative consequences or spillover effects for biodiversity and people. So this is also a consequence of the interconnectedness of our current world. So actions that are implemented in one place might have negative outcomes to land use, related to land use in places distinct and distant from where those actions are actually implemented. So now there is a growing body of empirical evidence documenting such type of land use spillovers, and more specifically leakages that refer to negative land use spillovers associated with the implementation of an environmental policy. And those can be, for example, the implementation of market-based policies such as RED, that is mostly based on carbon credits, or supply chain policies such as zero deforestation commitments in Brazil, for example, and other types of policy instruments like area-based, which are protected areas and so on. So by now, the issue of spillover effects and leakages from policy interventions is not contested, and instead is very well acknowledged. Yet, it still remains a major challenge that needs to be addressed to ensure the effectiveness of policy interventions, particularly in the context of biodiversity conservation policies. So here I'm going to show you again some text from the CBD documents to give you an example of those challenges. So please don't pay too much attention to all these texts. I'll try to explain it. And the basic question is, how are these goals and targets being set? And are the negative land use spillovers being considered during the process of developing and implementing conservation targets and policy interventions? So we don't know very well, unless someone here has been part of those negotiations. But what we do know is that there are important information gaps, and we have some discrepancies, maybe overlaps in the current global biodiversity framework. So by looking at some of these documents, we find those information gaps and discrepancies and overlaps related to land use spillovers. So for example, in 2019, as part of an annex, they already recognized that to accelerate progress towards the achievement of biodiversity targets, there was a need to better account for policy leakages, spillover effects, and unintended negative consequences of policy decisions. But that was it. It just stayed there. Then in 2021, they started the conversation around sustainable supply chains and net zero deforestation as part of another target, that is target 14. Yet there they also recognize that there is a need to better align and integrate private and public policies, and that the mechanisms have not been explicitly formulated yet. So then in 2019, after we have been through a global pandemic and through crises all over the world, we finally have a new global biodiversity framework. And what we see is the term spillover as part of a target 5, but referring to pathogen spillover, and no explicit connection to policy leakages and land use spillovers of policy decisions. So in a way, by incorporating pathogen spillover, they implicitly address land use change. Yet we have no concrete actions or indicators to measure these spillovers. So the message is that some challenges exist in the current global monitoring framework to adequately account for and anticipate the negative land use spillovers derived from the implementation of conservation actions. So the question that we ask is, can we anticipate these negative land use spillovers before policy decisions are made? And rephrasing this is, can we forecast land use spillovers to inform policy decisions? So here what I want to do is to show you the proof of concept of a model of how we can model the impacts of policy interventions and maybe start looking at the potential land use spillover effects. So this approach is based on what we know so far, and that comes from doing a more in-depth review about the conditions and processes leading to leakage and land use spillovers, and also the set of models and tools that have been used and that we know might help us to forecast what could be the potential land use spillovers emerging from policy interventions. So what we propose to do is to select a set of suitable models to help us visualize where those leakages might be occurring across the globe, then to quantify the extent of those land use spillovers, and finally to evaluate the potential environmental and social consequence. So that is to say the conservation trade-offs. So this would be an example of such modeling approach that we are envisioning. So imagine that we have a set of policy interventions based on the current global conservation targets. So for example, let's say the 30 by 30 target, but that is mostly based on protected areas. So at a global scale, protected areas might not have a huge impact in terms of leakages. We know that a local scale, as Camille showed us, might have very different outcomes, both positive and negative. But if we look at this very global scale, protected areas might not reflect those leakages. So we need to incorporate other policy interventions based on market dynamics, for example, market-based policies or supply chain policies, to see the global reconfiguration of land uses. So basically, we need to account for changes in land use demand or agricultural land, which are sensitive to these policy interventions at this global scale, Yeah, so that would go into a global simulation model to test how the economy reacts to these new policies. But the results would be aggregated by regions, and this makes it very difficult to assess in a more detailed way how policies in one region affect ecosystems and people in other regions. So to be able to visualize and quantify the potential land use spillovers of these policy interventions within and between regions, we need to allocate the change in land predicted by our global model. So for that, what we aim to do is to use a spatial explicit land use change model that can simulate the spatial dynamics of land systems and allocate those changes. And then at that level, we can start evaluating the conservation trade-offs with a bit more detail. And here, I also want to highlight the part that has to do with the implementation of these conservation actions that are operationalized at national and local scale. So to really be able to inform the design of land-based governance schemes and policy interventions, it is key to incorporate and adapt those global evaluations into contextualized policy management and conservation strategies that can be then translated into site-specific actions and interventions. And then that might help guide adaptive policymaking and inform national strategic action plans and environmental assessment. So the idea here is to have a suite of tools or methodology that can be useful to foresee the conservation trade-offs associated to the implementation of conservation actions, but with a strong focus on land use spillovers. So to finish, just the idea behind this whole exercise is to evaluate whether these goals and targets proposed by the global monitoring framework from the CVD and that are operationalized through a set of indicators are actually adequate to assess these unintended consequences of policy decisions. So the current global monitoring framework proposes a set of indicators that do not reflect the processes that they are supposed to reflect. So that is one part. And also by doing this exercise, we might be able to provide insights on how the availability of these types of evaluations and assessments and methodologies and its incorporation or mainstreaming into the global monitoring framework can really help guide and inform adaptive policy decisions and actions. So thanks for listening, and all questions, comments, and suggestions are welcome.
Thanks so much to you as well, Diana. Great talk. So do we have any questions now? I see one in the Q&A. That is, I think, for Camille. Did you see the question, Camille? It's how do you use your analysis to work out the trade-offs in detail as preparation for project implementers?
This might be more a question for Diana, I think. My work more highlights potential justice issues that can arise from mismatches in planning and implementation, but I think in terms of the level of detail for preparation, this might be more suitable for Diana.
Yeah, so I can wait in. So yeah, that's a really good question, because I show like this very simplified image of a method or of a methodology that incorporates different models and looking from global to local. So the idea is to have something that can be reproducible, and it might be initially set using default values. But the idea is that then we can incorporate specific and context-specific information so that people can really assess how this configuration of land uses might happen for a specific region. So yeah, we're still thinking about that. We still don't know if this kind of like integration of methods might work, or if we really need a completely different approach. But yeah, the idea is to go from default into context specific, user specific needs. I don't know if that's helpful enough.
Thanks a lot. There are more questions coming in now. So there is another one for you, Diana. How do you deal with the corruption associated with land use change, which Transparency International considers one of the top 3 corruption practices? Is there any way you account for corruption in your models?
I think that might be a question for Camille.
Corruption. Corruption, I don't know. My current work is focused on ways of including justice in global planning models. So trying to be a little bit more holistic and incorporate plural land use needs and plural values into these modeling frameworks. But in terms of dealing with corruption, I think that's the ultimate question there, isn't it? I'm not entirely sure how to even tackle that one, unfortunately.
Yeah, what I might think is, because it has been, I don't know if the question is actually going that way, but for example, with supply chain policies, we see that agents usually move to places with less law enforcement, and then that way, and that also, you know, corruption sort of like plays a role there. So the idea with this model is to see we can actually model those type of changes. So if we know that an intervention is implemented in one region, and then we see changes occurring at other regions, then that might tell us something about the underlying causes and dynamics that are driving those changes. But yeah, going from there into something more specific and targeted, yeah, that would be more difficult. We need more people working on that.
Yeah, I guess that would be a great question for those telecoupling researchers working on illicit financial flows. I know they are there as well. So yes, there is another question on the model presented. I guess that's for you, Diana, as well. Which data is needed to assess the spillover effects?
Yeah, a lot of data, and that's the challenge too, to see if we can harmonize all the different data that is needed to parameterize a global model, a global economic model that takes supply chain dynamics, so information related to yields, to elasticity of demand, elasticity of supply, prices, different commodities, different sectors. So all those type of information, the one that people usually use for this model is the GTAP database, that maybe you are all familiar with that, and also FAO data that they use for this input-output analysis. So all of that will go into the model, and then to produce something more spatially explicit, we need to incorporate a more high resolution, spatially explicit layers that sort of like are the determinants of change, so that determine where changes might occur, besides that more underlying economic variables. So yeah, there are like different levels of information and data that might be needed, that we need to harmonize in order to produce something useful and robust. But yeah, there's a challenge too. So if you have any ideas, all of those are very welcome. And also, if you can think of another approach that might help, So, for instance, the telecoupling framework helps a lot to frame this problem, but then to go from the framing to operationalizing this, there is a challenge.
Thanks a lot. For the moment, I don't see any more questions in the Q&A or the chat, so please feel free to put up more questions. Ah, no, sorry, I have to open it more. Yes, there is one more. How can we improve environmental justice outcomes of conservation projects in countries, regions where the existing political and institutional settings are inherently unjust, particularly against marginalized communities? I guess that goes to you, Camille.
Yeah, I think that's also an ongoing challenge, and the answer, I think, is more political. Shall we say, I think like that there's a value in terms of the sustainability narratives that incorporate justice or focus on justice. With their mainstreaming, it does provide a certain amount of maybe cultural leverage or a certain amount of social pressure on the types of actions that are acceptable by the international community. So this can help put some pressure on governments to respond in ways that maybe respect Indigenous land rights a little bit more than has been done in the past. But in terms of what we can do in our research, I think it's more about how we engage with these struggles, how we engage with these narratives really has an impact on the mainstreaming. But the answer would be more political, I think. You
want to add anything? Okay. Do we have any questions from you, Diana, towards Camille, or vice versa? Or also including the audience? If not, I would also be interested or asking you, Camille, I mean, how do you think that equity index, I think you presented in your paper, how could that actually be used by conservation planners? I mean, how could that guide planning?
I didn't actually go into that one too much during the presentation, but basically I compared the relative impact on land-dependent communities versus market-dependent communities, or communities who are better integrated into markets and maybe have more livelihood options, to see if current planning efforts were going to have a disproportionate impact on vulnerable groups within society. And just to kind of highlight a blind spot in conservation planning. So I think that this is really just a conversation starter more than anything, in terms of bridging these political discussions into more traditional conservation-oriented modeling communities. And I think part of that crossover can kind of cross-pollinate and generate more ideas on how do we plan for all of society, kind of thing, or what are we trying to measure. So the equity metric is maybe a start, but I honestly wouldn't dwell too much on it, because even if it is equitable, even if there's less of an impact on local or on land-dependent communities from that global scale, we're still not really looking at how conservation is practiced on the ground, or how ways in which it is implemented through what governance frameworks, in dialogue with which decision makers. So I think that is ultimately more important, and finding ways to expand mainstream conservation to include some of these bottom-up efforts, and in particular conservation agendas that are in support of social justice movements. I think that is really where we will hopefully gain the greatest headway in terms of achieving our environmental and our social goals. But yes, we are going to have to deal with corruption and conflicting national interests, I suppose, when it comes to forest management or land management. But I think that with a strong orientation of the conservation community, in the way conservation is, acceptably practiced and planned, then hopefully we can at least build some momentum or some inertia in that direction. I'm not really sure if that answered your question, but
yes, no, definitely, that's very inspiring. We also have another question from the audience that I think relates to this. So whether you think it would be useful to always have some sort of stakeholder engagement in conservation planning at different spatial scales, and whether in your experience that's actually something being done already.
Yes, I think it is at more local scales, and there are attempts to bring different voices into larger scales as well. There are there's a strong, I forget the exact name, but there is a indigenous group in dialogue with certain global fora. I'm forgetting everything right now, but to try and connect some of these dialogues. But I think that there's also a challenge to do it in a way that is maybe not tokenistic or that can create meaningful shifts in the kind of hegemonic structures as well. And I think also part of it will also be breaking down the compartmentalization in between interests, maybe. So conservation has always been about nature, so to speak, but I think trying to bridge it with agrarian movements or indigenous movements or any of these sorts of struggles will be really important as well. So conservation planning at different scales. It's an ongoing battle, I think, to do it meaningfully.
Thanks, Camille. There is also another question, I think more to Diana, on the spillovers, whether you only assess negative spillovers or are there also any positive ones that you've come across?
Yeah, yeah, there are also positive spillovers, but we usually don't talk about those because those are those are there, and what we see is that we have many negative outcomes, especially from policy interventions. So this is a very good example of this is the biofuel policy. So that no one understands very well, and know why all the unintended consequences of these policies happened, right? That it was intended to use renewable sources of energy to stop fossil fuel emissions, and then it ended up causing more emissions because biofuel crops displace food crops, and then food crops displace forests, right? So it's kind of like trying to foresee all these different unintended and maybe not so predictable consequences that might have might undermine our conservation efforts. So, but we do have positive spillovers, and those have been documented for protected areas at a more local scale. What we do know is if really those positive spillovers can upscale, and we can actually have more of those across the landscape when we implement policy interventions. So we also want to see what happens, and when we test different configurations and a different set of policies, instead of having these siloed approaches that we have, that economists assess at a very global scale, factoring in just economics, and then conservationists focused only on protected areas, assessing the spillovers using buffer areas. So it's trying to understand the landscape as a whole. But we do have we do have those.
Thanks. And a follow-up question to this. I mean, as you're considering several policies, somehow arriving in the same landscape, how do you deal with the issue of causal attribution? I mean, how can you say that then the spillover comes from the conservation action specifically and not from any other of those policies?
Yeah, that's always the question, and that's one of the challenges with these spillovers, to establish causal mechanisms of one policy causing this outcome. So that's difficult to assess, and what we are trying to do is well, what does the scientific literature says about the studies, that the different specific contexts that they where they have assessed these processes. So yeah, it's difficult because we don't have sound methodologies to actually assess the effectiveness, accounting for leakages, but also for additionality, but also for permanence, that are different sort of like variables that we need to take into account to really assess the effectiveness of a policy, and then to go there from causal attribution when you have many different agents and processes going on throughout the landscape. So that's what that makes it really difficult, but at least to understand the spatial dynamics and where are the hotspots of landscape transformation or modification that might be useful, or that might be important to I forgot the word, that might be important to take into account, because those are important for biodiversity and for climate. Then that way we can start focusing on targeted interventions in specific places where we can minimize those spillovers.
Yes, and I think
clear enough.
Yes, thanks. I know it's very tricky.
Yeah,
definitely one of the frontiers, I think, for telecoupling research in general. And
yeah,
maybe as we are, sorry?
How do you deal with causal attribution in your research?
Yes, I mean, there are several methods to that, but I'm not conversant with those models that you're using. So that's why I was curious. But something that comes to my mind as the topic of our last webinar was actually on the new EU deforestation-free products regulation. Is that one of the policies that you are considering for the modeling? Because that, I think, could yield quite interesting and also very up-to-date and much needed evidence to the conservation debate.
Yeah, because what we're thinking, again, I'm thinking about having different policies. What we are thinking is, okay, we can just like test using a different policy, run different scenarios and use only one policy for each scenario. That way we can see how the landscape, how everything behaves. So that way we can maybe establish more in a more easy way those causal mechanisms.
Yeah, I also see a lot of potential ground for interdisciplinary collaborations in that regard, and people focusing often on like single ones of these policies actually working together. Yeah. So,
and this this phenomena just highlights the need for this really much needed collaboration from many fields, from many grounds.
Yes. So I would say last chance, everyone, for any last questions, also from the side of the co-organizers of this webinar. Is there anything else, or also comments? That doesn't seem to be the case. So I would like to hand over to one of the co-organizers and co-hosts of this webinar, Johanna. And I forgot to introduce the other coordinators of the working group in the beginning. So I'm sorry for that. So we have Johanna Könen, Maria Jose Barola Rivas, and Cecilia Fries, who are coordinating this GLP telecoupling working group together. Johanna.
Yes, I will just share a few announcements regarding the activities of our working group. So we have these regular these regular webinars. But if you become a member of our working group, you will also receive our newsletter, where we share the recent publications and job opportunities. And we will send an email asking for your inputs to our newsletters before releasing the final newsletter. So feel free to share any recent publications or job opportunities or anything you want to also collaborate on in our newsletter. And in our last newsletter, you can also find our recent blog post about the last webinar that we hosted in May about the webinar on the EU regulation on deforestation-free products that Julie just mentioned. And it's also on the GLP homepage. Yeah, and so if you want to become a member of our working group, you can sign up through the link that we will actually post in the chat right now. And lastly, we are considering to host a session at the next Open Science meeting of the GLP that will take place in Mexico next year. And a potential topic could be to discuss how international policies and governance initiatives affect land use and land and really focus on their telecoupled effects. So if you're interested in contributing to such a session, yeah, please send us an email today or tomorrow to get in touch on a potential shared session organized by our working group. So if you have inputs, ideas, feel free to just, yeah, contact us. And we will also inform you via the newsletter if we decide to host such a session next year at the Open Science meeting. Yeah, so these are just a few practicalities on our working group. And yeah, I will hand back to Julie.
Great, thanks so much, Johanna. And yes, please join us in the working group if you're interested in the topic. And yeah, with that, I would like to thank you all for joining us today for this webinar. We hope we will see you again for future webinars as well. The recording will be made available on the GLP website, so you can also share with others who've missed if you found it interesting. And I wish you all a very wonderful Christmas time. All the best. Bye-bye.